How did a tiny island in Europe end up controlling nearly a quarter of the entire world? Seriously. Britain is small. Really small. You can drive across England faster than it takes to cross many modern countries. Yet somehow, this rainy island built the largest empire in human history. At its peak, the British Empire controlled huge parts of the planet. India, Canada, Australia. Massive territories in Africa. Dozens of islands across the Caribbean and Pacific. For a period of time, the phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," was literally true. So how did this happen? How did one relatively small country dominate global trade, oceans, and entire continents for centuries? Because honestly, it shouldn't have been possible. Especially when Britain constantly faced larger rivals. France had a bigger population. Russia had endless land and manpower. Spain controlled enormous wealth from the Americas. China was vastly larger. And yet Britain somehow outlasted or defeated almost all of them. The answer starts with geography. Britain being an island changed everything. Unlike countries in mainland Europe, Britain didn't constantly fear giant invasions from neighboring armies. That allowed Britain to focus on something far more important, the navy. While European powers spent huge amounts of money building massive armies, Britain invested heavily into ships. And not just ships. The best ships. Eventually the Royal Navy became the strongest navy on Earth. And controlling the seas during the Age of Empire was basically like controlling the internet today. Trade. Communication. Military movement. Resources. Everything depended on naval power. And Britain became unbelievably good at it. British warships protected trade routes across the globe while blocking enemies from doing the same. That meant Britain became rich. Extremely rich. And wealth creates power. But geography alone wasn't enough. Britain also mastered global trade better than almost anyone else. Instead of only conquering land directly, Britain built a massive trading network connecting nearly every continent. British merchants operated everywhere. India, China, Africa, North America, the Caribbean. Almost every major ocean route eventually connected back to Britain somehow. And then came one of the most important organizations in history, the East India Company. Which was basically a corporation with its own army. Imagine if a modern company had battleships, private soldiers, and controlled entire countries. That's basically what the East India Company became. It fought wars, collected taxes, controlled trade routes, and eventually helped Britain dominate India. And India became one of the most valuable parts of the empire. Resources, taxes, trade goods, manpower. India generated enormous wealth that helped power British expansion across the world. But Britain also had another gigantic advantage, industrialization. Britain industrialized before almost everyone else. Factories exploded across the country. Steam engines transformed transportation. Machines dramatically increased production. Suddenly Britain could produce more weapons, ships, textiles, and industrial goods than many rivals combined. That gave Britain an enormous advantage. Industrialization didn't just create wealth. It created military dominance too. Britain could build larger fleets, stronger weapons, and more advanced technology faster than most competitors. At the same time, Britain became extremely skilled at global strategy. Instead of trying to conquer all of Europe directly, Britain often preferred balance of power politics. Whenever one country became too strong, Britain helped its enemies. If France expanded too much, Britain funded coalitions against France. If Russia grew too powerful, Britain pushed back against Russia. This strategy prevented any single rival from dominating Europe completely. And while continental powers exhausted themselves fighting endless wars, Britain kept growing richer through trade and naval dominance. But Britain's empire was not built peacefully. Far from it. Colonization often meant exploitation, violence, famine, and brutal repression. Entire populations were controlled for economic gain. Local industries were damaged. Resources were extracted. Resistance movements were crushed. For millions of people living under imperial rule, the empire brought suffering alongside trade and modernization. That part is important to remember. Because when people imagine the British Empire today, they often focus on maps and military victories. But behind those maps were real people living under foreign control. Still, for over a century, Britain remained the dominant global superpower. British ships controlled the oceans. British banks financed global trade. British factories powered industrial growth. And the English language spread across the planet alongside the empire itself. So what finally changed? 2 world wars. World War I weakened Britain badly. Millions died. The economy suffered enormously. Maintaining a giant empire became increasingly expensive. Then World War II nearly destroyed Britain financially. Even though Britain survived the war, the empire emerged exhausted. Meanwhile, new superpowers were rising. The United States, the Soviet Union, and anti-colonial movements exploded across the globe. Countries no longer wanted to remain under British control. India gained independence in 1947. And slowly the empire began collapsing piece by piece. By the late 20th century, most British colonies had become independent nations. The largest empire in human history had faded away. But its influence never fully disappeared. Because even today, the world still carries the fingerprints of the British Empire almost everywhere. Global trade routes. International finance. Legal systems. Railroads. Parliamentary governments. The spread of the English language. Entire borders shaped by decisions made in London generations ago. Which is honestly insane to think about. A tiny rainy island in Europe somehow managed to dominate huge parts of the planet for centuries. Not because it was the biggest country, but because it mastered naval power, trade, industry, and global strategy better than almost anyone else at the time.